Working in sales in the United States has never been simple, but at the company where I worked, the pressure was suffocating. The targets weren't just numbers, they were professional life or death sentences. Everyone knew that a single mistake could cost not only your job, but also your reputation. In that environment, every glance was a silent competition, and every colleague's victory felt like a personal defeat. I was 47 years old and carried nearly 3 decades of experience in the corporate world. I've been through highs and lows, but in that New York office, it seemed like everything boiled down to proving, every single day, that I was still capable. Age, which to me represented maturity, was seen by many as a sign of wear and tear, but I knew my experience was my greatest weapon. The mirrored corridors reflected not only the tense faces of the salespeople, but also the dreams that could be shattered at any moment. Each desk was an island, with people isolated in screens and spreadsheets, but united by the fear of failure. And in that competitive sea, there was a captain who enjoyed sinking ships. My boss. He didn't need to raise his voice to command respect. His authority was embedded in the details. The silence that fell when he entered the room, the gaze of someone who always seemed to know more than everyone else, and above all, the pleasure he took in watching someone fail. And I, despite my resilience, had already become a frequent target of his provocations. It was as if he took pleasure in testing my limits, waiting for me to break. The younger ones, who still believed in the shine of their careers, looked at me as if I were some kind of survivor, but also an example of what could happen if you dared to stand up to that man. That day, however, I still didn't know that something would happen in front of 35 colleagues and change my life forever. I wake up every day at 5:30 a.m., even when I don't have to. The habit keeps me disciplined, and discipline is the only shield against the chaos that reigns in sales. That morning, I brewed my strong black coffee, mentally reviewed the most promising contacts, and headed to the office with the same confidence as always. I arrived before everyone, as usual. I sat at my desk, opened my client list, and began analyzing possible strategies to close at least 2 deals that week. It wasn't just about money, it was about proving that at 47, I could still outperform any young hotshot who thought they had more energy than experience. My colleagues started arriving. Some just waved, others looked at me with that mix of respect and doubt. They knew I'd once been one of the top salespeople, but they also saw that my boss never missed a chance to ridicule me. With every smile of his, there was a silent message: "Your time is up." I ignored it, took a deep breath, and focused on my work. I'd learned over the years that you don't win wars by fighting every battle. Sometimes silence is the most powerful weapon. But that day, my silence would be tested to the extreme. And it was amid the buzz of conversations in the open space and the clatter of keyboards that I sensed it. Something was about to happen. A different movement, a tension that seemed to cut through the air. Little did I know that in just a few hours, I would be humiliated in front of everyone. But also, right at the beginning of my greatest turnaround. My boss had always been a man of few words and many cruel gestures. He didn't need to raise his voice to demonstrate power. He just had to show up in the room for the atmosphere to grow tense, as if the oxygen was being sucked out of the air. He had that cold, calculating way about him and an almost artistic skill at destabilizing those around him. I'd felt it many times before. Acid comments about my age, insinuations that I no longer had the stamina for the market, and constant comparisons to younger colleagues, all said with a subtle smile, but with the precision of a blade. He knew every word of his was an invisible blow. That morning, he walked slowly to my desk. The sound of his shoes echoed on the polished wooden floor, and each step seemed to announce something bad. When he stopped beside me, I felt the gazes of dozens of colleagues landing on us. He wanted a spectacle, and I was the star. Without asking, he pulled my chair aside a bit and took control of my computer. "You've been accumulating clients, haven't you?" he said, fiddling with the screen. My heart raced, but I tried to stay calm. I knew something was wrong. He wasn't there to help. He was there to destroy. It was in that instant, amid the tension, that I noticed something curious. While he humiliated me, everyone was watching. Every pair of eyes followed the moment. And a reflection came to me that I always share when I tell this story. In life and business, there will always be people trying to erase you. That's why I say never let them erase you either. By the way, if you like real stories of overcoming like this one, it's worth subscribing so you don't miss what's next, because the most incredible part is still to come. He then began deleting my contacts one by one, the cursor sliding across the screen like an executioner's blade. Names I'd spent years building disappeared before everyone's eyes, as if they'd never existed. I felt the tightness in my chest, but I refused to show weakness. I wouldn't give him that pleasure. The silence in the room was absolute. No one dared intervene. No one dared even cough. Only the dry clicks of the keyboard filled the space, each one sounding like a shot to my dignity. I knew this wasn't just about deleting clients. It was about erasing me. But there, in the midst of the embarrassment, something began to ignite inside me. A flame that told me, you won't end like this. Not today. Not in front of these eyes. And it was that flame that kept me standing, even as my career seemed to be erased in front of 35 colleagues. After deleting my entire contact list, he stood up from the chair with that victorious smile. He looked at me as if he'd won a battle I didn't even know had started. Then he cast a quick glance at the others, as if to show, this is what happens when someone tries to challenge me. I took a deep breath and stayed silent. My instinct screamed for me to raise my voice, to denounce that injustice. But something inside me said it wasn't the time. It wasn't enough to shout. I needed to find a way to turn it into a definitive victory.
The room slowly returned to its normal rhythm, but I knew nothing would ever be the same. Some colleagues avoided my gaze, perhaps afraid of being associated with me. Others stared at me with compassion, as if watching a silent funeral. What no one knew was that, inside, I was beginning to prepare my revenge. I sat back down, looked at the blank screen, and realized there was nothing left. No clients, no history, no data. It was as if they ripped years of work from me. And in that moment, I understood. If I wanted to survive, I'd have to do the impossible. That same day, the silence in the room after my boss's actions still echoed inside me. It was as if every gaze piercing me was a cruel reminder that I'd lost everything in minutes. I saw colleagues bowing their heads to avoid meeting my eyes, as if I'd caught a contagious disease called failure. There were also those who delighted in my fall. I noticed hidden smiles, disguised looks of satisfaction. In the sales world, one less means more room for the others. And in that moment, I was the perfect victim to feed many people's ambitions. I felt like I'd been stripped naked in public. It wasn't just names deleted. They were stories, relationships, years of building trust. Each client was the fruit of effort, sleepless nights, persistent phone calls. And in seconds, it all vanished. My boss, satisfied, walked to his office without looking back. For him, it was just another display of power. For me, it was a sentence. But what he didn't know was that every blow against me was fuel for something greater. I looked at my desk, took a deep breath, and closed my eyes for a few seconds. I felt the weight of the humiliation, yes, but also something new, a flame that refused to go out. And in that moment, I realized it wouldn't be the end. I still had something to prove, not just to him, but to everyone who'd witnessed that cruel spectacle. In that instant of inner silence, I began to think about everything I'd achieved over the years. At 47, I'd faced crises, lost jobs, rebuilt my career from scratch. If there was one thing I knew well, it was the bitter taste of falling and the pleasure of bouncing back. I remember the times I'd knocked on clients' doors who laughed in my face before signing million-dollar deals with me. I recalled the moments when I was told I was finished, only to prove I was just getting started. All of that formed the invisible armor I carried in that moment. I opened my eyes and looked again at the blank screen. There were no more contacts, but there was something much greater. My experience, my courage, and my ability to reinvent myself. They could erase data, but they couldn't erase my essence. I decided right then that I wouldn't wait weeks to rise again. No, I'd do it that same day. Not just for me, but for each of those 35 colleagues who'd witnessed my humiliation. I wanted them to see with their own eyes that no one erases someone born to shine. I stood up from the chair, straightened my jacket, and for the first time in hours, smiled. The war was just beginning. While I was still digesting the pain of what had happened, I heard a murmur from a nearby desk. One of the analysts was talking about a potential big-ticket client, a tech company about to invest heavily in corporate solutions. It was the kind of deal that could change any salesperson's life. In that instant, my heart raced. I knew I needed that opportunity. I had nothing left to lose, and that's exactly why I had everything to gain. The problem was, there was no official record of my contact with them. Without a list, without history, without system support, I'd have to leap into the abyss on the strength of my word alone. I walked to my desk and started typing. I found a reference number in an old email, and without thinking twice, dialed. On the other end, a firm voice answered, laced with formality and impatience. It was the procurement director. I introduced myself, stayed calm, and began explaining how our company could meet their needs. But before I got far, he interrupted coldly. "I don't see anything in your history, sir. Who was it again?" My name seemed to mean nothing, and in that instant, I realized my greatest challenge was just beginning. I knew landing that client would be like climbing a mountain without a rope, but I also knew that if I succeeded, I'd have not only my dignity back, but something much greater, the definitive victory over my boss. The call progressed with difficulty. With each argument I presented, the director seemed more suspicious. He wanted proof, numbers, guarantees, and all I had was my voice and the conviction that I could deliver results. I explained success cases I'd worked on, told stories of satisfied clients, and tried to build credibility through my 47 years in the market. But with every sentence, I felt him weighing my words like a risky investment. At one point, he chuckled discreetly. "You know, I've heard a lot of salespeople promise the world. The difference is, they had records and references. You have nothing." It was like a knife to the gut, but I stayed firm. I knew if I backed down, I'd be lost. I took a deep breath and replied, "That's true, sir. Today I have no records, but you know what I do have? The courage to bet my entire reputation on a perfect delivery. If I fail, I'll never call you again. But if I deliver, you'll have the most committed partner you've ever known." There was silence on the other end, a silence that weighed more than 1,000 words. And in that instant, I realized that maybe, just maybe, I'd planted the first seed. While I was still talking to the director, I noticed my boss's icy stare cutting across the room. He'd already spotted my attempt to close a new client and seemed to relish the situation. He knew I was without my list, without references, without support. For him, this was just another show, and I was the clown destined for failure. He approached slowly, hands in his pockets, and that side-of-the-mouth smile he always used to unsettle me. "Trying to impress someone, huh?" He whispered low, but loud enough for nearby colleagues to hear. "It'll be fun watching you crash and burn again."
I stayed silent, phone still to my ear, but inside, my anger burned like fire. He wanted me to explode, to lose control, but I knew my revenge had to be quiet. And more than that, it had to be public. On the other end of the line, the procurement director awaited my response. My boss, meanwhile, leaned against my desk, crossed his arms and watched, as if he'd bought a ticket to the show. The colleagues around pretended to work, but I knew everyone was tuned in. That moment made it clear. I wasn't just trying to close a deal. I was fighting a sabotage that had become personal. If I failed, he'd have the ultimate victory. But if I won, he'd be the one humiliated. That's when I decided to bet everything on a bold move. Instead of continuing to sell just the numbers, I changed my approach completely. "Sir," I said to the client, "I won't waste your time with stats anyone can read in reports. I want you to know who I am." There was silence on the other end. Then I continued. "I'm 47 years old, with over 25 years in sales. I've closed deals many thought impossible because I learned that business isn't just about products, it's about trust. And what I'm offering you today is more than a proposal, it's my reputation." As I spoke, I felt my boss shifting beside me, impatient. He hadn't expected me to have the guts to expose myself like that. For him, I should have been trembling, begging. But what I was doing was different, turning my vulnerability into strength. The client took a deep breath on the other end. "You're asking me to trust you without anything to show for it?" The question sounded like a verdict, but it was also an opportunity. I smiled, even though he couldn't see it. "Exactly, sir. I'm asking you to trust someone who's never given up after a fall. I give you my word, this will be the best investment you make this year." I risked, but if he accepted, there'd be no greater victory. I knew that moment could change not just my day, but my entire story in that company. On the other end of the line, the procurement director fell silent. A long, uncomfortable silence that seemed to last hours. My heart pounded like a drum in my chest, and for a moment I feared he'd already decided to end the call. Around me, the room was in suspense. My colleagues pretended to type, but their eyes pierced me like blades. I could feel their expectations, their morbid curiosity. Everyone wanted to see if I'd rise or sink for good. My boss, still leaning on my desk, crossed his arms and flashed a smile of pure contempt. He believed he had already won. For him, that silence was confirmation I was done. It was the sound of my defeat echoing through the office. I swallowed hard and closed my eyes for an instant. I felt my hands tremble, but I couldn't back down. I'd bet everything on my word, and now I had to wait for the verdict. "Sir," I ventured, "I'm not offering easy promises. I can only guarantee my dedication will be absolute." The silence lingered. Each second felt like a century, until suddenly I heard the most liberating sound I'd ever encountered in my career. The director took a deep breath and said, in a grave tone, "You know what? I think I'll give you this chance." For an instant, I couldn't believe what I'd heard. "Sorry, sir, what did you say?" I asked, trying to contain the emotion. He repeated firmly, "I want to close with you. Prepare the contract. We're talking $95,000. I felt my body shudder. $95,000. The amount echoed in my mind like a symphony. It was more than a contract. It was living proof that no one, absolutely no one, could erase me. I stood up from the chair, phone still to my ear. The entire office was in shock. Some colleagues widened their eyes, others smiled discreetly. And my boss? Oh, my boss couldn't hide the hatred. The arrogant smile had vanished from his face. I ended the call firmly, thanking the client for the trust. As I hung up, I took a deep breath and let my hands fall onto the desk. The final click echoed like the announcement of a historic victory. The room, still silent, seemed to await my reaction. I just smiled. I didn't say a word because I didn't need to. The $95,000 contract had already spoken for me, and everyone knew, right then and there, that I'd won the war my boss had started. The office plunged into absolute silence when I hung up with the contract confirmation. I felt the weight of the victory spread through the room like a silent wave, every gaze fixed on me, reflecting astonishment, respect, and even a hint of relief. My boss, who seconds before seemed like a predator in control, took a step back, shoulders rigid and expression hardened. He tried to smile, but the gesture died halfway, betraying the fragility he never showed. In that instant, his aura of power began to unravel. In a dry voice, he said, "Beginner's luck," trying to reduce my achievement to chance. The phrase fell flat, without echo,
because there was no luck in landing something so big under those conditions. "Deliver, and don't make a fuss," he added, but his attempt to downplay my feat only highlighted his defeat. For the first time, I realized his authority wasn't unshakable, and the entire office did too. It was as if the spell had broken in front of everyone. He called me into his glass-walled office, trying to reclaim the appearance of command. The transparent walls turned that conversation into a public spectacle, every gesture exposed like on a courtroom stage. "How did you pull it off without history?" he asked, eyes narrowed, almost in fury. I replied calmly, saying I'd used my experience, my word, and my nearly 30 years in reputation. The simple answer seemed to disarm him because there was no way to counter it without admitting what he'd done. He tried to discredit the contract, raising hypotheticals of risks, delays, and possible failures. I countered each one, detailing timelines, scopes, and guarantees, showing documented proof from the client. Each of his arguments dissolved like smoke in the face of my planning's clarity. The more he insisted, the clearer it became to the onlookers that his intent wasn't to protect the company, but to sabotage my win. Power, finally, was slipping from his grasp.
That's when the compliance manager entered with a tablet in hand. In a neutral tone, she informed that system records showed mass deletions at 9:12 a.m. directly from my boss's terminal. The words hung in the air like blades. He swallowed hard, tried to say it was a routine cleanup, but the manager left no room for excuses. "Routine doesn't delete active contacts in front of 35 witnesses," she replied, making the room even heavier. He clenched his jaw, but he was cornered. There was no justification that could erase the facts. The truth, finally, was visible to all, and it wasn't me who needed to prove anything anymore. He did, now having to explain himself. The mask of authority he'd always worn was shattering before the watchful eyes of his colleagues, and the scene had a taste of justice I'll never forget. Meanwhile, I decided not to dwell on the personal feud. I returned to my computer and wrote an objective summary for the board. Scope, milestones, responsibilities, deadlines. I copied legal, operations, and finance. I included logs and screenshots and technical attachments. I made sure to show that the contract wasn't just an emotional win, but a solid professional process. In toxic environments, transparency is the greatest armor. On Slack, the celebration channel exploded. My name appeared next to the $95,000 figure, and reactions poured in from other offices in Austin and Chicago. Congratulatory messages came from teams not even directly involved in the deal. Even the finance team, known for its coldness, dropped a curt, "well done." Meanwhile, all I wanted was a glass of water and a minute of silence to absorb what had happened. A few minutes later, I saw my boss take a call from the VP. His expression changed instantly. The color drained from his face, and his hand trembled as he adjusted his tie. He left the office almost tripping over the carpet, heading toward the corridor to the executive floor. Each step seemed heavier than the last, as if he were walking to an inevitable judgment. The office watched in absolute silence. I didn't celebrate out loud because I knew the greatest response had already been given. Instead, I reopened my schedule, reviewed dependencies, and prepared the project kickoff. I hadn't won to show off, but to demonstrate consistency. I'd learned over life that victory without execution is foam, and foam evaporates. I hadn't come this far to shine for a moment. I'd come to stay. And everyone realized that when I returned to my cubicle with the serenity of someone who knew exactly what to do next. The first to approach was Lila from the mid-market team. She brought a hot coffee and placed it discreetly on my desk, saying only, "Nice turnaround." The simple gesture meant more than any applause. Next to the cup, she left a post-it with an onboarding checklist, offering help without me having to ask. Her silent generosity touched me, because in competitive environments like that one, solidarity was rarer than an annual bonus. Soon after, Noah, one of the new hires, asked to talk. "Can I sit in on the kickoff? I want to learn how you run it," he said, with a genuine spark of curiosity. I agreed immediately and invited him to the public calendar. "Bring tough questions," I encouraged, because I knew watching isn't enough to learn. You have to get involved. There, I realized my victory wasn't just personal, it was becoming a reference for others. Meanwhile, the integration channel confirmed in record time the allocation of needed professionals. The solution architect and project manager were already scheduled. Finance opened the purchase order with set deadlines, and legal sent the data protection contract package. Everything was turning like freshly oiled gears. The contract wasn't just a figure, it was an engine now driving different areas of the company. I also received an email from the client, short and direct. "Trust is rare. Count on mine." Attached were 3 well-defined delivery milestones, 7, 21, and 45 days, with formal acceptance on the last. That message gave me more strength than any internal praise, because it showed the client not only believed in me, but was willing to walk the process together. That's what truly validated my effort. At coffee, some colleagues started joking about my age. 47 and still with all that stamina, they said lightly. I laughed and replied that discipline, reading, and sleep were my secrets, plus never confusing ego with delivery. They laughed, but I sensed an important message there. Experience isn't a burden, it's an advantage when used wisely. That kind of dialogue, once unthinkable, now flowed naturally. The VP stopped by my desk in the afternoon. He didn't make a speech or grand gestures. He just tapped the surface twice and said, "Good work. Focus on flawless implementation." It was enough. Recognition in that American environment was direct, no frills. I liked the measure, fair, precise, and functional. It was the kind of signal that shows you're on the right path without creating a spectacle around it. In the aftermath, colleagues began sharing old stories of humiliation, subtle sabotages, distorted targets. My victory had opened a quiet floodgate, giving courage for others to name problems once swallowed silently. And naming is the first step to change. I saw on their faces the feeling that something different was beginning, a timid but present cultural shift.
I decided to organize everything I learned into a living document. Risks, lessons, responsibilities, cutoff dates. I made it publicly available for all, so it could serve as a reference. I believe sunlight is the best antiseptic, and clear processes eliminate room for noise and intrigue. My small victory now served as a guide to transform internal practices. As the day ended, Manhattan lit up its lights from the 32nd floor. The buildings pulsed like arteries of a city that never rests, and I felt small before that vastness. But at the same time, I felt whole, because I understood it wasn't about crushing anyone. It was about rising and staying risen, even when the wind blows against you. That's true resilience. Before leaving, I closed my laptop and took a deep breath. My revenge hadn't been planned, but it became a natural consequence of my consistency. 35 colleagues had witnessed it, all uncut, and they knew I'd not only survived, but won. Yet inside me, there was the certainty that this was just the beginning. The real war was still to come, and I was ready to face it. The next morning, I arrived early as always, but the feeling was different. The office seemed to breathe at another rhythm, as if something invisible had shifted. Colleagues who'd once looked at me with indifference now exchanged firmer greetings, and even the silences carried a new respect. I knew that at 47, I'd not only landed a $1 million contract, I'd earned credibility. And credibility is the most valuable currency of all. My focus, however, wasn't on celebrating. I sat at my desk and dove into the schedule, reviewing milestones and adjusting dependencies. The client had already sent requests to accelerate deliveries, and I needed to balance expectation with realism. No trust survives broken promises, and I knew the next step was turning every word spoken into impeccable execution. That's what would secure my place. While organizing tasks, I received a discreet message from legal. There was a clause that, if overlooked, could generate extra costs if the scope expanded without formalization. I took a deep breath and noted it. I decided to include that info in the next client meeting because I'd learned credibility is maintained with candor, not risky concessions. The courage to say no is as important as the boldness to say yes. The office filled up gradually, but an absence caught attention. My boss didn't show for the daily meeting. The official reason was strategic commitments, but everyone knew what that meant. Meanwhile, a people and compliance manager passed by with a folder in hand and neutral expression, heading to the executive floor. Rumors spread silently, but no one dared comment aloud. The system was starting to move. I didn't dwell on it. My role was to protect the project and deliver results. I made sure to post in the general channel that all questions should be centralized with me and the project manager, making it clear there was accountable and accessible leadership. That simple gesture reinforced trust and reduced noise. Leadership, I realized, isn't a title. It's the willingness to provide a clear address for problems when chaos threatens to take hold. By late morning, the client called to request accelerating one of the milestones. I explained calmly what could be delivered early, what would require extra effort, and what would compromise quality if moved without replanning. He listened silently, and at the end thanked me for the clarity. He decided to stick with the original plan. In that moment, I understood something valuable. Clients trust boundary setters more than those who promise the impossible. In the afternoon, I finalized a proof of concept with a small extra shine beyond the agreed. It wasn't showboating, it was strategy. Measured over-delivery creates positive memory without extra costs. I documented the improvement and turned it into a product suggestion, linking it to the corresponding price adjustment. Unplanned over-delivery is a trap, but calculated excess is an investment. That's how I intended to build lasting trust. Then I received a private message from an old colleague. "Seeing you yesterday made me want to stick around a bit longer," he wrote, referring to the times he'd thought of leaving because of the toxic environment. I felt the weight of that message like a quiet responsibility. My victory was no longer just mine. Now I was a reference for those seeking courage, and references carry heavier burdens than contracts. As the sun hid between the buildings, Manhattan lit up its glass and light skin. I looked out the window and thought about what that day meant. It wasn't about money, not about humiliating my boss. It was about proving no one can erase someone with method, transparency, and resilience. The best revenge, I realized, isn't destroying someone. It's building something so solid no one can tear it down. Before leaving, I closed my laptop and spent a few seconds watching my reflection in the glass. I saw a 47-year-old man carrying scars, but also an intact flame. I smiled to myself and thought, if a $95,000 contract was the response to public humiliation, perhaps the ultimate response is creating a culture where no one needs to be humiliated to prove they deserve respect. And if that change has to start with me, let it start with me.